Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar, Washington Update, Rules of Engagement in 2016. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Council on Foundations webinar, Washington Update, Rules of Engagement for 2016. We'll get started at 2 p.m. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Council on Foundations webinar, Washington Update, the Rules of Engagement for 2016. My name's Tim Huber, and I want to run over a couple of the housekeeping items for us before we get started. It's pretty basic, but if you need to access the help desk at any point during the call, just select the option in the toolbar at the top of your GoToWebinar navigational panel. To ask a question, you have a question box on the right-hand side. Please feel free to type in your questions. We'll get to as many as we can, and if we can't get to all the questions, we'll follow up with you after the call. To exit, just press the gray X. We find that a landline is the best way to listen to the webinar, but you can join from your cell phone or computer as well. And finally, we will be recording this webinar, and we will send out a recording shortly after the conclusion of the webinar. Thanks, and with that, I will turn it over to Sue Santa.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Sue Santa, the Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Legal Affairs at the Council on Foundations, and thank you so much for joining us for this webinar about the rules of engagement for 2016. Before we get started, I just wanted to do a couple quick announcements. I am delighted that the Council has welcomed last week our brand new Vice President for Public Policy. His name is Hadar Susskind, and he comes to us with nearly 2 decades of experience in public policy, philanthropy, and social movements. He's got strong relationships across the field, and I'm sure that many of you will be hearing from him or seeing him, talking with him over the next few months as the Council dives into a lot of really exciting activities, including our annual conference in April. So welcome to Hadar. We're thrilled to have him on board with us. We're going to dive right into the content here. Our webinar this afternoon has 2 parts, the first part being quite brief, and then we will really dive into the true substance around engaging. But we're going to kick off first hearing from Don Snyder, who's with the Federal Policy Group. He is one of our lobbyists who works with the Council on Foundations, and he's just going to give you a very top-line lay of the land of what's going on right now in Washington. I want to tell everybody we're doing it quickly in this call because we will be hosting a webinar in March where we will dive in with much more detail on the landscape in Washington and the issues that are on the table and the Council's positions and all kinds of things like that. Right after Don speaks, I'll then turn the program over to 3 wonderful individuals who have a great wealth of knowledge in the area of engagement in the political and issue sphere. We'll be welcoming David Thompson, who is with the National Council of Nonprofits, and they are such a wonderful partner to the Council on Foundations. And if you do read our newsletter, Washington Snapshot, that we distribute each week, I want to give a big kudos and loud cheer to David, who is the one who authors the section of our newsletter that is news from the state. So we're thrilled to have that partnership with them in delivering that information to all of our readers. David Thompson has invited David Heinen to join us, and David Heinen is with the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits, deeply familiar with all of these issues. And then they're going to be led in conversation by Catherine LeBeau, and Catherine is one of our attorneys and our policy director here at the Council on Foundations. So first, Tim, let's dive into what's happening on the Hill. Don, I'm going to turn this over to you to give us some top-line information on what the Council and basically everyone here in Washington is keeping an eye on right now.
Thank you, Sue. So if we could actually turn to the first slide of this lay of the land deck, I wanted to highlight at a very high level, very, very high level, what we can expect from Congress in 2016. And so the first important thing that I would like to highlight is a factor in 2016 that you may not have in other years, which is the congressional calendar. So if you look at the slide here, you'll notice that it's a leap year, and in this leap year we have 251 work days, but Congress is only going to be in session for a fraction of those days. The House 111 of the 251 days, and the Senate 149 of the 251 days. And by contrast, in 2015, the House was, for example, in session for 132 days, and the Senate for 187 days. So clearly they're going to not be here and working as much as they are typically, and not as much as one might think. And so if you look at the chart, you'll notice that the absences are going to be peaking around the third and fourth quarter of 2016. And this is something that speaks to what is one thing that is unique about 2016, which is that this is an election year, and this is not just an election year, but it's a presidential election year. And so there are a number of things that means. One of them is that members of Congress frequently have to be back in district. Whether they have a competitive campaign or not, they may be campaigning for others, so they're not going to be around as much just by virtue of that. And the second thing is there's a less of an appetite for trying to accomplish big, ambitious things in an election year, and I think that influences the number of days that they choose to be here. And if we turn to the next slide, we sort of leads into the second factor, which is the specific agenda. So 2015 was a year that was dominated, as sort of has been the recent trend, by must-do legislation. So you had things like the so-called doc fix. There was an Ex-Im Bank reauthorization, an omnibus spending bill. You had the tax extender package that happened at the end of the year. And these must-do pieces of legislation were very much, in a literal sense, must-do. If we didn't, for example, pass the spending measure and the short-term measures that went before it, the government wouldn't have been able to spend any money. If we didn't reauthorize the Ex-Im Bank, it would have ended. And so these types of legislation dominated 2015, and a lot of the other legislative priorities had to find a way to fit into that context. In contrast, 2016 is much more open. Almost all of the must-do legislation haven't already been passed in 2015. And so as a result, there is some space, if perhaps not complete universal appetite, for Congress to do other things. So, for example, Speaker Ryan has indicated publicly several times, in fact, that he wants to roll out, major policy initiatives. So as you'll see from the slide, areas like the economy, national security, all the way down to things such as combating the use of executive actions. And some of these are going to be more controversial than others. And what they mean in terms of concrete legislation is kind of anybody's guess and speculation at this point. But it's important to see that the legislative agenda isn't even dominated by necessarily legislation. In terms of the legislation, though, that we're pretty sure we can expect is the appropriation bill. So if you may recall, last year, Congress started by attempting to move legislation that would fund the government in something other than what they call an omnibus form, so to move individual appropriation bills for each of the areas. That broke down sometime in the summer because of some current events that sort of swamped the process and made it much more partisan. This year, Speaker Ryan has indicated that he wants to do that again, not the partisan part, but he wants to pass appropriations bills and use what's called regular order, which is to say, take the bill through committee, have a markup, to have a vote, to follow the normal process. And so we expect that that's going to begin fairly soon. It's not easy to pass these things, and it could take some time. And in terms of timing, they need to be wrapping these things up in the late summer and certainly by the early fall. Moving to the Senate, Majority Leader McConnell has not exactly adopted the same expansive vision that Speaker Ryan has. Instead, he said that he wants to focus on more doable items, and you'll notice from the list there he's indicated things such as energy policy, national security, healthcare policy, and the like. And so you may see there is some overlap in terms of priorities with the House, but it's not clear exactly how that will translate and whether or not the House and the Senate see eye to eye on what they think is most important, or even more specific to our issues, how sort of tax policy, tax law will fit into this. Certainly there are some things that are currently being discussed, and as Sue indicated, when we have that future webinar, we'll go into more detail about those. But moving to the final slide, the next slide, I just wanted to point out that it's important to not make the mistake of thinking that Congress is a monolithic thing. Every few years there's turnover in Congress, and of recent years there has been sort of more congressional newness than perhaps previously. If you look at the very first sets of bullets, nearly 50% of the sitting representatives have less than 5 years of tenure. So that influences dramatically both sort of opportunities and challenges that affect how much work can get done, and it certainly affect our ability to accomplish our legislative priorities. In addition to that, and it's not represented on the slide, but you have a fairly new Speaker of the House, you have a new chair of the Ways and Means Committee, and so again, each of these committee turnovers and leadership turnovers provide us both challenges and opportunities that will affect both our agenda and others' agenda as sort of legislation continues to move forward. And I think that presents a pretty good picture. With that, Sue, I'll turn the time back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Don. And I just wanted to highlight two things that key into some of the comments you made. The first is around the fact that with less legislative days and kind of not a clear agenda, we may not see a lot of big bills outside of perhaps appropriations passing. But we do know that there still is a lot of appetite ultimately to have tax reform, which in all likelihood would be after a new president is elected and we have a new administration. And so we all know from experience, decades of experience, that tax bills get built over time. And as we've been talking with senior staff, even in the recent weeks, we know that some of the policy issues that have been raised in prior drafts of tax bills will be the same policy issues that they're going to try to address in future tax bills. So with that, we have a little bit of guidance and a little bit of time to educate, to try to steer people in different directions, maybe change some minds on a number of big kind of policy concerns that go often to where is there waste, fraud, and abuse. For on the philanthropic side, is money being parked? Is it not moving? Is it not getting where it needs to go? Are the tax incentives that try to drive charitable giving really working? Could they be better? Are they directed toward the right taxpayers? And then, of course, more specifically, we'll look for opportunities to, if there are any. You never know when something actually might move, when there are things that might have to be fixed and bills, smaller bills, come up, where we might be able to continue to advance some of the priorities that were on the table last year and moved pretty far last year, including the private foundation excise tax simplification, and hopefully at some point being able to expand the IRA charitable rollover to include donor-advised funds and other vehicles and lower the age and all those types of things that the Council has long been supportive of. Then I also just wanted to note, as I looked at the registration for this webinar and really thought about the work that many of our participants do, many of you are engaged with programs that have some element of public funding, federal funding. So I think that Don's comments about the appropriations bills and the fact that those may, in fact, at least be attempted to move in some regular order is particularly important because, of course, those will be the vehicles where there will be funding or not funding for some of the programs that are really high priorities for you. So we will be looking at this more deeply in March. But now I want to take this opportunity to turn to the topic of this webinar, and that is rules for lobbying and election-related activity. And I want to throw this over to my great colleague, Catherine LeBeau.
Thank you, Sue. So I have the privilege of going over very briefly the general basics of the lobbying and election-related activity rules that apply to private foundations and community foundations and other public charities. And then after I'm finished, we will get to the more interesting part, which will be a series of hypotheticals along with David and David to illustrate how some of these rules play out in your day-to-day work, or how you might see some of these rules throughout this election season. So lobbying, private foundations, as I'm sure many of you know, are generally prohibited from lobbying, with some exception, and namely there's a self-defense exception for private foundations for activity that affects the existence of the foundations, its powers and duties, or its exempt status, or the deductibility of contributions to a foundation. Public charities like community foundations can engage in lobbying. It's generally allowed as an insubstantial part of their overall activities is the default rule. And both types of organizations can generally engage in other types of advocacy work that do not fall within the federal law definition of lobbying. So you can educate lawmakers about your work, you can educate members of the public about policy issues, you can work with regulatory bodies, including in the development of regulations, you can provide technical advice about legislation, and there are several other of these examples of things that you can do on a regular basis that do not qualify as lobbying. So for a private foundation would be permitted, and for a public charity would not count towards your overall lobbying limitation. So for a public charity, you can either be governed by what's known as the insubstantial part test, which says that no substantial part of a charity's activities can involve carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation. And we don't have clear guidance on what is substantial legislative activity, though generally speaking, about 3 to 5% of an organization's overall activities can be devoted to lobbying within this rule. On the other hand, you can also elect the Section 501H election, which gives you a more clear limit on what your overall lobbying activity can be as a percentage of your overall budget, with $1 million being the absolute maximum. And if you choose this election, you also have an additional limit on the amount of grassroots lobbying activity that you can do. And there are penalties for public charities that exceed their lobbying limits. There's a 25% excise tax imposed on the excess lobbying expenditures, so the amount that exceed your permissible lobbying amount. And in worst case scenarios, you can have your tax-exempt status revoked if you continue to exceed your allotted total over a period of 4 years. So within the federal definition of lobbying, there are 2 different definitions that we talk about. The first is direct lobbying, and this is, for example, if you're going to meet with a legislator about a particular bill, it's most likely considered direct lobbying. And it's direct communication with the legislator, so elected representatives at any level, federal, state, or local. And notably, a legislature also includes members of the public if the legislation at issue is a ballot measure. And we'll get to that, I believe, a little bit later in one of our hypotheticals. And in your communication, you also must express a view about specific legislation. So, a piece of legislation that is being considered by that legislative body at the state, federal, or local level. The other definition of lobbying is for grassroots, and this is a communication with the public expressing a view about specific legislation that includes a call to action. So a communication in which you express a view and you urge the recipient of the communication to take action, to contact their legislatures, and to promote or oppose a particular piece of legislation. Funding lobbying activity. So both private and community foundations can fund lobbying with certain restrictions. Community foundations can fund lobbying up to their own lobbying limit, so either as an insubstantial part of their overall activities or up to whatever their allotted limit is under the Section 501H limitation. Private foundations can generally make 2 types of grants to avoid a taxable expenditure for lobbying: a general support grant or a project-specific grant. A general support grant is permissible even if a grantee has lobbying activities, so long as there's no earmarking for lobbying within that grant. So if the rules are followed, then even if the grantee subsequently uses some of those grant dollars for lobbying, the foundation won't incur a taxable expenditure if the grant was not earmarked for lobbying. For a project-specific grant, a foundation may fund up to the non-lobbying amount. And you can rely on a grantee budget, if it's reasonable, to determine what the non-lobbying amount of an overall project would be, and as long as the money is not earmarked for the lobbying amount. So there's an example there in your slides. If there's a grant request for $50,000 for an overall project that will cost $100,000, and $10,000 of that will go towards lobbying, a foundation, and let me clarify here, I'm talking about private foundations in particular, since they are prohibited from doing lobbying, and for community foundations that choose the Section 501H election, they can follow these rules for general support grants and project-specific grants, and the activity, even if it is lobbying, will not count towards their overall limit.
Catherine, I want to make just one interesting point here. In fact, two private foundations, in your example here, two private foundations could each fund that at $50,000. Is that correct?
Yes, so long as, well, they could fund it at, if it was a project-specific grant that had a allocated portion of the budget for lobbying, they could fund up to $90,000 of the overall $100,000 cost of that project in the terms of the agreement. And so long as the money wasn't earmarked for lobbying, if it was later used, a portion of their money was then later used for lobbying, they still would not incur a taxable expenditure.
Thank you.
And finally, election-related activity and foundations. So, as you know, under no circumstances is a nonprofit or foundation allowed to participate in or intervene in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to a candidate for public office. And the penalty for this is a tax on campaign intervention under the Internal Revenue Code, 10% of the amount spent on the intervention, with additional penalties imposed on foundation managers, and then an even steeper tax of 100% of the expense if corrective action isn't taken in a timely manner. So luckily for us, the definition of campaign intervention is fairly narrow, meaning there are a lot of things that foundations are allowed to do that would not qualify. It's a facts and circumstances test, though there are some things that we clearly know we cannot do because they would be considered campaign intervention. So for example, endorsing a candidate, making a campaign contribution, making an expenditure on behalf of a candidate, asking candidates to sign pledges, and making any communication that seems to either explicitly or implicitly favor or oppose a candidate, and criticizing or making positive remarks about a candidate. So all of those things clearly would fall within the definition of campaign intervention, and anything that falls outside of that, you know, there's some gray areas that we're going to get to in just a moment in our hypotheticals. So as I've mentioned several times now, despite all these rules and the complexities of these rules, there is actually a lot that you can do to engage with lawmakers as long as you follow the rules. And David and David are helpfully going to walk us through a few hypotheticals to illustrate real-life examples that you might encounter either during this election season or if there's, you know, a ballot referendum happening in your state, for example. So David and David, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Catherine, but don't go away. You're not off the hook because we have lots of questions where you're in on the action too. Hello, everybody. I am delighted to be here today. I am thrilled in particular to be here today because yesterday I had an epiphany in this area of nonpartisan election-related activity. I was moderating a panel over at the Habitat for Humanity conference, and a question came up from a person, a hypothetical, which was, I'm frequently asked to be part of the host committee of a political fundraiser. They want me because of the name Habitat, not because of me personally. So what should she do? And so we gave the usual legal advice, which perhaps we'll get into here. But as I was talking, it occurred to me, this subject, nonpartisan election-related activities, engaging with candidates during the season, the political season, is an antidote to money in politics, dark money, all the things that everyone wants to be upset about for good reason. When voters are engaged, politicians are much more likely to pay attention. Votes overcome, I won't say Trump, votes overcome cash. And when politicians, elected officials know that you're running a voter registration drive, a get out the vote drive, in a nonpartisan way, they know you have influence in the community and they want to tap into that community. So they're going to pay closer attention to you. So what we're talking about here, don't just think of it as democracy. Don't just think of it as the right thing to do and good for humanity and civilization and changing the world. It's good for, well, all those things. So that's why we're doing it. That's why David Heinen and I in particular are excited and engaged in this subject area. So that was my epiphany, that nonpartisan election-related activity is an antidote to money in politics. You can believe me or not, but I'm going to stick with that. We go to the first hypothetical, please. Here, several in the story we have here, David Heinen is in North Carolina, so we'll speak with that accent. Here's the setup. Several nonprofits in North Carolina come to you asking advice on nonprofits, community foundations, want to do some nonpartisan voter registration activities across the state, and they want to talk to you about what foundations would be interested in funding this work. So David, what do you tell the community foundations and nonprofits? And Catherine, jump in on what are the special rules for private foundations as well. David?
Thanks, David. And this is David Heinen in North Carolina. The first thing I tell them is that legally they can absolutely do nonpartisan voter registration activities and coordinate it together. The key is that they need to be certain that they're being nonpartisan, not coordinating it with campaigns, and not targeting it to just people who are voting one way. In other words, don't ask a question on an issue that comes down on partisan issues. How do you feel about this? And if you answer yes, tell them to vote on November 15th and end it there. And if you answer no, help them register to vote and provide them more accurate and more useful information on the election. So that the basic is to be certain that it's not coordinated in any way with partisan actors and that it is done in a nonpartisan way.
So don't cherry pick your voters.
Yeah, don't cherry pick your voters. So that's the first thing. The other thing, so kind of legally, that's the basics. So you certainly can do it. I tell them that they're making a good decision in doing it. Nonprofit Vote has done research in the last two general election cycles and have found that when nonprofits contact people, help them register to vote, provide them some real basic information about elections, that it increases voter turnout among every age group, every demographic group that's been measured, and so that it really does have a big influence, kind of reiterating what David was just saying, that it really is important. It's not just that it's a nice thing to do, but it really does empower the people who are served by nonprofits. The other practical thing that I suggest to nonprofits is really think as they're coordinating voter registration work with other organizations and with community foundations, to really, and this is less of an issue with their community foundation partners than with their other public charity partners that they may have, to be certain that the other partners are all doing things in a way that is truly nonpartisan, that is legally nonpartisan, that they have the same kind of ground rules, the same procedures in place for how they're doing things, but also to look at the reputation of the other partners and whether they're seen as truly being nonpartisan, because sometimes Catherine did a good job in her brief explanation of what the laws are, of explaining what the tax penalties are, but sometimes reputational risk is enforced much more, whether by the media, by the general public, or by candidates for office who you're not supporting, or who feel that that what you're doing is adverse to their campaigns, much more enforced by that, and the impact on the nonprofit's reputation is much greater and more likely to happen than any tax penalties. So just to think about that. We've seen in North Carolina, for example, that some groups that kind of lean legally do things in a nonpartisan way, but get really close to the limit, that other nonprofits that have partnered with them have seen their reputation harmed for that reason. So that's my suggestion. And as far as funders, I'll let Catherine go more into the rules for private foundations. We would encourage nonprofits to look for general operating support for it, maybe to look to community foundations for more of the support for the reasons that I think Catherine will probably tell us.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just would like to add that from a legal perspective, a community foundation or a public charity could fund this activity, and it does not qualify, assuming it's nonpartisan and done in a fair and balanced manner. This does not qualify as electioneering or lobbying activity in any way, and so there wouldn't be those sorts of restrictions on funding this activity for a community foundation. For a private foundation, it's perfectly permissible to fund nonpartisan voter engagement activities like voter registration, but if a private foundation makes a grant that's earmarked specifically for voter registration, there are some additional requirements in Internal Revenue Code section 4945F that the foundation must follow to avoid a taxable expenditure. And for instance, 4945F says that the organization conducting the registration activities must be a 501c3. The activities must be conducted in 5 or more states over more than one election cycle, and the grant can't be earmarked for the use in one specific state or in a specific election cycle. And there are some additional requirements under the tax code as well, but private foundations who look to fund this activity should know, it's permissible, but there are some additional rules to follow.
Well, great, thank you. And I'm sure everybody on the call perked up when you said 4945F. We all love a good.
I did.
We all love a good tax code citation. I should have said at the very beginning, after we finish the hypotheticals, or if we run out of time toward the end of the call, we're going to be doing live questions and answers. There's a chat box in the lower right-hand corner of my screen, hopefully yours too, where you can go ahead and ask questions. Don't wait. We don't want to have to wait the minutes of people typing in questions. If something occurs to you, if we're talking about something that you want a little more information on, or if there's a question you have, not hypothetical, a hands-on question you're dealing with today, go ahead and type it in. They'll be reviewing it, and Sue will hit us all with them in a timely fashion, maybe even interrupt along the way. Let's go to the next slide. Hypothetical number 2 is all about Joe and Jane. You know, everyone on the call knows Joe and knows Jane. These are folks that have a lot in common. They're well-known. Joe's a well-known executive director of a respected community foundation. That might be a redundant phrase. Jane is a board member. They both take every opportunity to badmouth candidate X. Joe and Jane are both political animals. Neither care so much about policy as they do about politics of everything. As I said, we all know them. With them in mind, have a couple of quick hit scenarios to share with you. First one is, what happens when they pop off, either or they pop off in their usual way they do at your foundation's board meeting? David?
I think it's a great learning opportunity for the board that depending on which of the two of them is sharing their enlightened opinions or the not so enlightened opinions at the board meeting, it's a good opportunity for another board member or for the executive director to remind everybody that that the organization, the foundation, does need to be nonpartisan in everything they do, and in external communications that it's extremely important to be very mindful of that.
So private meeting, no big deal, but it's an opportunity.
It's a good opportunity. That's right. I mean, in that case, it's just happening internally, so that's a good learning opportunity.
Catherine, jump in if you want, or we can go to the next one.
Feel free to move on.
Next slide. How about same scenario, saying the exact same things, but at a public gathering hosted by your organization?
Hopefully the learning opportunity has happened at that point. One thing that I think is good to prevent any of these is to have internal discussions and policy. So both at board meetings and even at staff meetings, particularly with key staffs, to have policies about being nonpartisan, about how you represent yourself at gatherings hosted by the organization. If it does happen there, though, it's probably good to, in as tactful of a way as possible, to for the other one, or either the board chair or the executive director. Again, it depends on whether it's Joe or Jane who's sounding off in public. To after the fact, be pretty clear that everything that is said is not anything that was said that appears to be a partisan political opinion is not being said on behalf of the organization, but may just be a particular speaker's own opinion.
Mm-hmm. This does come up often. I heard it yesterday a few times in a public setting, so this is not hypothetical. This one's real. And at the end of the slides, there are going to be some references or some links to resources that the council has put together and is putting together. I think it's a great idea. It just occurred to me for boards to have a 5-minute discussion about, okay, it's election season, what are the rules, what can we do, what should we be aware of. It's just a good governance type of thing, because these things do come up all the time. Next one, please.
David, I agree with you on that, and I would say at a staff meeting too. We usually, particularly in a big election year, do that, as you said, for a brief reminder at a board meeting, but also at a staff meeting.
Good point. Thanks. Next one, please. Next slide. This one is, let's say Jane is exuberant and she's sending an email to a donor. We're talking to community foundation here, I guess, or not, I guess, who agrees. So Jane sending a solicitation email to a donor, potential donor, who agrees on the topic. What do you do there, if anything?
Well, at first, I remind Jane that, of course, she used her personal email rather than the organization's email, and of course, she did it from not from the organization's computer. And remind her to be pretty clear to the donor about that. I mean, I think that the key for most of these is that it's better to be proactive, have a clear policy, and maybe in that 5-minute discussion with the board and with the staff, remind them that hey, it's fine to do these things, and you certainly have the First Amendment right to get engaged in politics, but make sure that you're not using the foundation or the organization's email address, you're not using the phone, you're not using even the computer for doing it, just to be very clear that you've got that firewall. So if it has happened, it's probably best to just go for Jane to go back to the donor and remind her that she certainly appreciates her support of the organization, but does want him to be very clear that what she had said was her own thoughts, and she didn't mean to imply that the organization took any position on that.
Okay, and to be clear to anyone listening in, if you're shaking your heads that we sound like a bunch of legal prigs who are trying to be thought control, the whole point is protecting the organization. So the only reason we're focusing on these things is because the institution, the organization itself, it could be at risk by the behavior of others. So we're digging into ways to remove risk. Next slide, please. We get a little more complicated just as you'll see these things go. Joe is going to do an op-ed. He publishes an op-ed in the local paper. The byline identifies him as executive director of the respected community foundation, and he references the work of the organization as part of the article. What issues does that raise for you, David and Catherine?
Yes, I mean, it raises a couple issues. One, it's probably best usually an organization's got some type of review process for an op-ed. Not always. Sometimes, I've seen a private foundation executive director who writes an op-ed on her own. May or may not identify her as the head of a private foundation that gets into things that are getting pretty close to being political. It is always best to try to make it a personal thing, not an organizational thing. And sorry for sounding too much like lawyers again, David. But I think that it's kind of the same thing to do that. If it is possible to avoid in the byline identifying her as Joe as the ED of the community foundation, that's great. I mean, often that's the reason why a paper is gonna publish something. So the other question might be is whether if it is an op-ed that maybe is a blend of policy and politics. If it's something that could wait until after the election, that might be another thing, and see if if Joe or Jane would mind if it would still be timely to publish something after an election.
That raises the thought that if the motivation is to influence the election in favor of a candidate or against a candidate, that's probably a good reason to hold off. Next slide, which is a variation on this theme with maybe a clarification. Going back one. And that is that the op-ed identifies Joe as the writer and his organization, but stresses that these are his personal comments and not those of the foundation, not the views of the public or official views of the foundation. That's pretty much what David was saying. Does that work though? Does that work though if the byline says that alone? Let's say it's a scree, but it says that in the byline alone. Does that protect the organization?
It's probably gonna be more evidence to protect the organization from the tax penalties that Catherine mentioned earlier. I mean, I do think that as I said before, that to me the reputational risk is sometimes as great as anything, and I'm not sure that to the general member of the public that that doesn't just underscore more that they're affiliated with the organization. And if somebody who feels like that they have been slighted by the content of the op-ed wants to then write a letter to the editor saying that this foundation is that foundations are private foundations, community foundations, charitable nonprofits are all required to be nonpartisan. Clearly, this person did it. That it did something that was partisan. Most of the public's not going to get that nuance that maybe there was a clear enough disclaimer on there. And I think that in the court of public opinion, you probably lose, even if in the tax court you might win. The other thing I'd note about an op-ed versus the previous one we talked about with the donor is that sometimes there's probably more risk with an op-ed just because you have got a much wider reach, and you don't know what the know whether they feel the same way as you do to every reader of that. Whereas if you're talking with a donor and maybe cross the line a little bit, if the donor agrees with you, there's probably not going to be any harm that comes from it.
True.
Whereas
True.
in an op-ed, there's going to be somebody who disagrees with you, or else the paper's not going to publish it.
Speaking of the court of public opinion, those of you who do read the Washington Snapshot from the Council, which is an excellent publication, and you do get down to the part on the state policy issues that Sue mentioned that we, the National Council of Nonprofits, prepare. If you ever see a politician's name, I can guarantee there's going to be another politician from the opposite party also mentioned in the same article. We go out of our way to demonstrate and live nonpartisan every step of the way, and we never use party references if we can avoid it. And I think that's just a good practice for everybody. It forces us to not be partisan by being extremely careful in this area, being very thoughtful on the subject. Let's go to the third situation.
David?
Sure. Catherine.
Hi, yes. We've gotten a few questions that in reference to this specific hypothetical, so Sue's going to jump in there.
Sure.
Just a moment.
Just quickly, I want to emphasize what David is saying about kind of internal and preemptive activities. The Council on Foundations as well is really taking a lot of effort this year. We've already started, educating our own staff internally about what can and can't be done. We are located in Washington, D.C. It is a general election year. We know a lot of people are active and engaged, and we just want to be sure everybody's kind of clear on the guidelines. And this really goes to something that David mentioned earlier on, which is, there's the legal challenges and sometimes reputational challenges. And so to the extent that we can always demonstrate that we're buttoned up and we do it the right way, if something were to occur, we can at least point to the practice that we have of really trying to be thoughtful and to educate our own teams. Now, add to that, this year the Council's annual conference will be in Washington, D.C. in April, and I hope we'll see many of you there. But we're even going to be sending out notices to anybody who's speaking on a panel or in a plenary discussion, just reminding them that the Council is, nonpartisan, non-political, and that the conference is intended to be the same way. And I know people kind of reflexively want to go to political speech sometimes. It's hard to resist the impulse, but we will be reminding them that this isn't the forum to do that. So, we think the more you can be buttoned up, the better, especially if just in case something should happen, you can show good practice. And we will have some resources at the end here, and the Council team is always here to help point any of you to resources. So there were a couple questions that came in that I thought we just fielded now so we can then continue on to hypotheticals. The first one that I just want to get to is there was a question as to whether the same rules apply for foreign legislation or officials. Catherine?
And yet the short answer is yes. It can be a little trickier in that situation to determine whether someone falls within the U.S. federal tax law definition of an elected official, or whether something is legislation. But yes, the same rules would apply.
So it sounds like you're saying the most cautionary thing to do is default to yes, and then explore if it's within an exception, but
correct.
Consider it yes. Okay, great. And then I want to pose this second hypothetical. A private foundation uses the office facility, their own office facility, free of charge to film a candidate's campaign TV spot after office hours. Is the private foundation at legal risk? My response would be yes. And that is because you are using an asset in the facility, a resource. This is considered a resource of the foundation for a political candidate free of charge. I would say that even if you were charging them, it gets thorny. Even reimbursement does get thorny. The exception would be, I think, Catherine, if you were to make that available to all of the candidates. So they all could use your beautiful conference room or facade or whatever it might be to film their ads, then I think you're trying to attempt to be nonpartisan. But the short answer, I believe, is yes. Do you agree with?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Catherine's nodding her head. Okay,
and,
that was an easy one.
And David?
So I would agree with you on that. That it is legally there's a way to do it. In fact, in the IRS revenue ruling that talks about the different factual situations around being nonpartisan, it talks about a way very similar to what you said, that to make sure that you're charging the same rate that you're charging to everybody else, to offer the same opportunity to every candidate to do it. But I think you're absolutely, and we get this question a lot about a variety of things, whether it's a meeting space or a mailing list or other facilities that an organization has, and it's just really difficult to ensure that you're giving the exact, the identical opportunity to all, especially when you're approached by one. And also, again, there's a reputational thing that probably they're not all going to take you up on it, and then it appears that you're favoring one, even if you've had the firewalls in place.
And David, I do want to jump in. Don, our political consultant, was just flagging for us too that we should all be as concerned about reputation. Well, very concerned about reputational risk. It's the thing that typically these are the things that the media picks up on, that members of Congress pick up on, that appear to make us look not buttoned up or playing a little loosey-goosey and outside the laws. And so that's why here at the Council, and David, I know you do this as well, both Davids, we're always mindful not only of keeping an eye on those reports of people actually running afoul, but sometimes it's those news reports or those comments we hear from people about things that just seem to be a little, not quite right, that can be as damaging. So that's why you'll hear for all of our participants on the call, we talk so much about reputational risk. So with that, Catherine, I'm going to throw back to you and David to continue on with our next hypothetical.
ready to go. The November elections are nigh. We're seeing that several of the ballot measures in multiple states. Not every state has this opportunity for the voters to rule on specific things, but some of the ones we have here are a TABOR, Taxpayer Bill of Rights type of amendments to the Constitution, which would restrict the power of legislators. Others may want to repeal property tax exemption for 501c3 organizations, and then others can earmark special sales tax revenues for nonprofit arts groups. Let's say you're an arts funder, so it'd be certainly of interest in your focus area. David, what are those three different categories there? One's the TABOR type of budgeting issues, another is repeal of property tax exemption, and then third is a focus area type of ballot measure. Perhaps you've already referenced, but just to be clear to everyone, charitable nonprofits, community foundations can engage, this is considered direct lobbying, for lobbying the voters, the people who vote on the legislation, lobbying them through campaign or through election activities. Vote yes on Proposition X, vote no on Proposition X. That is a lobbying activity, not an election activity. But David, what are those three categories flagged for you? I know Catherine has some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, and I think that Catherine actually gave good answers in her summary. So I mean, I think that just thinking about lobbying, the insubstantial part versus the test versus the 501H election that Catherine mentioned, and then particularly on the one related to property tax exemption, the concern about that may be self-defense, so it may not be lobbying, and that may change the rules for private foundations and for community foundations regarding whether they can do it for private foundations, and then whether it counts as a lobbying expense for community foundations. And I'll let Catherine.
Well, we're talking ballot initiatives. Ballot usually means election-related stuff, thou shalt not for most of us, but ballot initiatives are the exception. That's why we have the hypotheticals to drive home the point that ballot initiatives are a lobbying question, not a lobbying maybe question, not a election thou shalt not question. Catherine?
And
yeah. David,
Go ahead, David.
I was just going to add one thing to what David said about the reason for this. We see this in North Carolina. We're one of those states that's kind of in between. We're not California, where there are a lot of ballot initiatives every year. Nonprofits know this and are familiar with it. We don't prohibit them, so we have them occasionally every few years. We'll have a constitutional amendment or a bond initiative, but it's not a regular thing on the ballot. So nonprofits assume that it's a thou shalt not. And foundations do as well. So that's why I think it's in those states that have them occasionally that it matters. It comes up more.
Thanks. Catherine?
Yeah, so I just wanted to note that we have a very recent, end of 2015 case from the federal tax court, Parks v. Commissioner, that for the first time in a really long time looked at the definition of lobbying on ballot measures for private foundations. And that case involved a series of radio ads on some ballot measures over the course of a few years in the state of Oregon. And the court in that case was looking at whether the specific radio ads were lobbying in the circumstances. And to make that determination, the court said that a private foundation refers to a specific legislative proposal. So again, remember, one of the prongs of the definition of direct lobbying requires you to refer to a specific piece of legislation. So an organization refers to a specific legislation, even if they don't mention it by name, if they use terms widely used in conjunction with the measure or describe the content or effect of the measure. So if you're communicating publicly around a ballot measure, keep in mind that you don't necessarily need to mention the specific measure by name. If what you're saying is publicly recognizable as associated with the measure, it may be considered direct lobbying if you express a view on it. And David, I think we have time for one more hypothetical.
And I do want to get to a question.
But don't go away. I want to make sure we get a straight ruling on the repeal of property tax exemption private foundations. It's a ballot initiative, property tax exemption, presumably the foundation, private foundations own property and benefit from that exemption. Would that be a self-defense as I've described it?
As you described it, most likely, yes, is the lawyer answer.
Okay, that's close enough, and of course you dig in more, much more deeply. So we have.
David, yeah, I'd like to actually pose a question to you guys because a very interesting question came in, and then I hope to also get to our third hypothetical. So I'm going to ask you guys to give a quick answer on this, and to the person on our webinar who posed this, we can get you a more detailed answer as well. The scenario is, the hypothetical here is that a member of Congress has asked a foundation, private foundation, to fund an evaluation study of his or her federally funded plan. And of course, a lot of times members may look for kind of study and information from foundations. That's one of the things. There has to be this ask made of a foundation. Now, it also happens that this particular member of Congress and the head of the foundation know each other and have aligned political views. So the question is, can the foundation legally fund that study, and does this pose, are there conflicts of interest that should be considered here? So I just wanted to raise the question, if David or Catherine have any quick answer to that, but to the person who asked that question, we will get something to you about that. So Catherine, David, anybody have some initial thoughts?
Oh, come on.
Well, lawyers, we all say it depends.
Okay,
right.
If the answer is it depends, there is the exception to the lobby rule.
Yep.
For providing research, providing data. If it's in your mission area, if you do water conservation and it's a question about babies that doesn't smell right, if it's in your focus area, if you guys are the experts in the field, then it would be normal for the committee chairman or for a policyholder or policymaker to ask for research, and it's fine to supply research. Not particularly, it would stink if it came out in end of October to show how powerful the politician is. Purely policy issue focused on it and promoting a point of view or promoting a policy objective. It's fine. It's actually a good idea because you're advancing the debate. The question is, does it smell right in the public perception? Has a lot to do with timing.
I think that's right, David. Yeah, and I also think this really goes to the complexity that you can get to in these rules. It is facts and circumstances. That's why the initial reflexive answer is it depends. And so we can connect with this particular participant to see if they want to learn more. I'd like to, in the last couple minutes we have, I do want to turn to your fourth hypothetical to at least get some top-line answers, because this issue of town hall meetings is something that comes up quite often. So I'd love to just close on this issue.
I'll ask it quickly and ask David and Catherine to chime in. The issue is candidate forum, town hall meetings, where you're inviting the candidates, you're bringing them in to address your issues or address multiple issues in the community. What if only one candidate shows up? That's a thorny one. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so this is Catherine, obviously. So typically, I think you would want at least a handful of the candidates to show up to avoid the perception of partisanship and the perception of electioneering at the very least. And as a funder, if you were considering funding such a town hall event, you would also want to ask some questions like how they were going about inviting the candidates to the event, how they were billing it in the public invitations to the event, and that sort of thing, just to, again, ensure that all candidates were given equal opportunities and that there was not that partisanship component.
David, I suspect you're going to say that if you've waited till the beginning of the event to discover you only have one person, then you waited too long. What are your thoughts?
I would agree, but it happens sometimes. One thing that is very helpful, and we've done these before, and can get tedious, but to have really careful well thought out ground rules for it. So in terms of how much time will be allotted to each candidate, exactly what the format's going to be, provide that to all the candidates in writing as part of the invitation or as you're following up with them, and then do regular follow-up with the campaigns to make sure that they're going to show up. But still, sometimes only one of them will show up, and then that's when it's really important to first make sure that you still follow your ground rules. So even if you've got an hour allocated for it and had planned to have that time, you had divided the time up between 3 candidates, that may mean you end after 25 minutes because you told the candidates that they can have 2 minutes for an opening statement and 90 seconds to respond to each question. So you still keep it to that. And then also to remind people beforehand, probably both before and after you start the town hall, that you'd invited all the candidates. You had the expectation that more were going to show up, but that this was something where the identical invitation went out to all the candidates. One question that comes up is whether you do the Clint Eastwood approach and have an empty chair for the other people who didn't show up, or whether you just have the chair for the one person or two candidates who do show up. My thought on that, but I know there are differing opinions on this if it actually happens, is that if you have that empty chair, while it does show that you'd invited the other candidates, it sometimes implies to the audience that you're mocking the other candidates, or that you're annoyed with the other candidates. My thought, and this is just my own personal opinion, is that it's safest to just not refer to them at all.
So don't be like Clint. There's lots of material on Candidate Forum on Nonprofit Vote website. I'm sure the council will have some. Council of Nonprofits has materials on Candidate Forum, candidate questionnaires, things like that. Very productive use of your time to both read those materials and engage in this area. Sue, back to you.
Yeah, I want to thank everyone for participating. You guys have given us a lot to think about. These are some really, really interesting questions and scenarios, and I'm sure that our participants have many, many of their own that they could bring to us with questions. And so I do want to remind all of our participants who are members of the council, we of course are always here to help you navigate your issues. We've posted some resources here for you, but we can also answer the specifics. For those of you who did ask questions on this webinar format, we will be back in touch with you to get those questions answered, so that that you feel that we've not only paid attention, but that we can help you in any way that we can. I want to remind everybody that in March we will be having another webinar. This time it will be on what's happening in Washington. With that, I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you very much to all of our speakers. And on behalf of the Council on Foundations, we'll see you soon on another webinar.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.